Tonight's Bartlett lecturer is Dr. Diane Obenchain. Dr. Obenchain has taught in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Peking University on a regular basis since 1988. As a scholar of comparative history of religion, her area of specialization is the Ru, or Confucian tradition, although she also studies Taoist, Buddhist, and other religious traditions in China. She is visiting professor of religious studies at Fudan University and consultant to the United Board for Christian Higher Education in Asia. She is also a fellow at the Casperson School of Graduate Studies at Drew University and was a research fellow here at Yale Divinity School in 2003 and 4. Dr. Obenchain received her MA degree from Stanford University and her PhD from Harvard, my fair school, 1984. She was tenured as Associate Professor of Religion at Kenyon College in Ohio and has taught at Waseda University in Tokyo, the National University of Singapore, as well as several universities in China. She has published an annotated translation of collected papers on 20th century Chinese philosophers, including Fen Yulan. She is co-author of a textbook to introduce the study of religion in China, forthcoming from Peking University Press. She is project director, author, and editor for a small dictionary for the study of religion in Chinese and English, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. And she has joined Max Stackhouse, Don Browning, and Peter Paris in preparing God and Globalization, Theological Ethics in a Pluralistic World, a multi-volume collection of papers published by Trinity Press International. Dr. Obenchain will begin a new position in February of 2005 as full professor at Calvin College. Please join me in welcoming our 2004 Bartlett lecturer, Diane Obenchain, who will be speaking on God, Confucius, and human rights.
Hello, and I'm so deeply honored to be here to deliver the Bartlett lecture for the year 2004. The invitation came as a big surprise. I was just heading out to Xi'an, China, to give a paper at the first Christian Buddhist conference in November 2003. And a myriad of themes and stories and images have come to my mind from my work over the last 16 years. I wanted to share every single one of them with you, but I had to choose, and I hope the ones I've chosen are the ones that are illustrative and meaningful to you. I want to thank Dean Attridge, Dean Bartlett, and others for this kind invitation and for all of your interest in China. I'm grateful to the Yale Divinity School and the Overseas Missionary Studies Center, who so kindly supported my work here for about a year and a half. I'm also grateful to the United Board for Christian Higher Education, for which Dick Wood, former dean here, is now president. They've supported all of my work in China since 1994. And I'm also very grateful to my classmates of YDS, Class 2002, they are just finishing this year, and to the Sophias, who all became good friends. Blessings to you all. My talk has three parts: God, Confucius, and human rights. I have a lot to say, and I have, I hope, some good pictures to share with you. We're going to focus on the first part on my teaching of religious studies in China for the last 16 years. The second part moves to Confucian moral cultivation and what I think Christ brings to that moral cultivation. And then the third part looks at an alternative view of human rights, which I think comes from the Confucian tradition and dovetails nicely with the Jewish covenant tradition. In preparing this lecture, I have been in silent conversation with some good friends, Andrew Walls, John Hare, James M. Gustafson, Stanley Hauerwas, and David Novak, all of whom you will hear about in due course of the talk. I'm not a specialist. I'm a field hand out there turning the soil, and I'm hoping that some of those who are very good in theology will think about going out to China soon. The students are ready for you. Their English is ready. The books are there. It's now time for you to go. First, I bring greetings to you from Shanghai. I'm going to be moving now just to a few images to take us to China. First of all, here's a picture of the Yangtze River. Shanghai is a colorful mix of mercantile development, ancient Chinese culture, the Yangtze Delta outflow, and a new purpose to become the cutting-edge city of the 21st century. Everywhere is a construction site in Shanghai, and if you look quickly at the next one, you'll see the brand new museum that has just filled the racetrack. The former British racetrack is now the famous Shanghai Museum. That's a little scratchy, but you can see all the color and glitter that has come to Shanghai. I'm teaching at Fudan University. I'm teaching religious pluralism to pastors of the three self-church, self-governing, self-propagating, self-supporting. This is a Chinese government program to bring the pastors to the university for university education. I'm also teaching Christian ethics to graduate students. Some of them are in fiber optics, some of them are in Marxism, and some of them are studying ethics. I'm also teaching a third course, the Introduction to the Study of Religion in the West. Last spring, I was teaching in Hangzhou, and Hangzhou is the former capital of the southern Song dynasty. Now you'll recognize a little bit more. Having seen Shanghai's glitter, we move now to the cultural heartland of China, this is looking out on Westlake. Westlake is surrounded by beautiful mountainous hills that are filled with 2,000-year-old pathways that take you to Buddhist temples and to Taoist sites. And Chinese garden culture is still in its heyday. Still in Hangzhou today, you can find wine. There's some of the beautiful pathways through the mountains that you can climb and visit the ancient Chan monasteries. I think we've got a picture of a Chan monastery here. Actually, this is one of the Buddhist sculptures in the monasteries, and I think we have another one too. Right. These are actually 1,000-year-old images, and I don't know if you can see, but this hand reaching down is so polished. It was originally rough-carved stone, but after 1,000 years, so many Chinese hands have touched it that it's smooth like marble. And it's just a pleasure to behold. The whole cliffside is called Feilai Feng, the cliff that flew over from India, and it's filled with these Buddhist images that were carved 1,000 years ago. Next one, I guess. Now, Hangzhou is known for its garden culture, and I hope you sense the rich cultural aesthetics of the Chinese view. I think we have one other of the gardens. Oops. Yeah. Here's a recently opened Buddhist temple that when I arrived, a Buddhist monk twirling the wonderful beads came out and greeted me at the gate, and as if I were an old friend, and told me, this is again is a Buddhist monastery just opened, told me that this monastery goes back to the 4th century and had been closed during the Cultural Revolution, is just recently reopened, and they're training young novice monks. And as he talked, he asked me if I were Christian, and I said I was. And I thought it was interesting that he sensed that already. Why would a Westerner be coming to a Buddhist monastery after all? He then said, well, you know, Confucius had it right. It's all about being human and finding out what is right and what is wrong and acting on it. And I thought that was very interesting coming from a Buddhist monk. This is the most famous Chan monastery called Linyansi. And this is the monastery that Zhou Enlai put his hand on and said, don't touch it, during the Cultural Revolution. And so it's here for us today, and I think we can see the Buddha image inside it in the next one. There we are. And I'm sorry for the quality, but the temple is designed that you can't see in. The Buddha is hidden, and it's only when you step inside that you can see this exquisite Buddha, which has lasted 1,000 years. He's huge, and it's a very awe-filling sight to see. And again, Zhou Enlai protected this during the Cultural Revolution. And I think we're, for the moment, going to rest here. I'm going to move on to the fact that in Hangzhou I taught a course, a new one, on the Chinese Confucian classics and the Old Testament. My purpose was to compare the voices and genres and themes of composition, and it was a very successful course, and I think we started a small center for Old Testament studies at Zhejiang University. Most of my time has been spent at Peking University since 1988, and we're going there now. There it is from the air. Peking University sits on the old Qing dynasty gardens of the prime magistrate that worked for the emperor, and he lived across the street from these gardens. And here's the West Gate. Entering into the, you'll see that the West Gate is guarded and people are carted going into the university. It's not easy to get in. Next one, please. But once you're in, you see the old Christian college called Yanjing University. There were several Christian colleges, and in fact the United Board runs on some of the endowment of the old Christian colleges, continuing their mandate. This is the philosophy department, the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Peking University, where I've worked for the last 16 years. Next one, please. This is No Name Lake, and I'm sorry that it's reversed, but it's okay. You'll see the okay, wonderful, thank you. It's called No Name Lake, and the famous water tower in the back. We used to ice skate on this pond in the winter time. The ecological changes of China, since it's become so industrialized, have warmed it up so that we no longer can ice skate. But that's where I've been for 16 years, and that's where I've walked for 16 years. I think we have one or two more, and then I think we're... Yeah. You'll notice the crosses. You see them there? In the little bridge going across? This is the garden of Jill Sackler. Jill Sackler has restored, and her husband also, Arthur Sackler, restored a lot of the gardens and have a beautiful museum on campus which is worth visiting. And I think we have one more, or is that the end? And yeah, now this is the end of it. I hope you get the sense of a dragon's head in this long walkway here. I lived in the building in the background. In fact, I lived in a different room every time I was there, so I think I've lived in every room in that building. But this long walkway marks the old gardens of the Shaoyuan, the gardens of a spoonful of water, which is a garden made in the 16th century, which opened up this whole area and brought the emperors out. And it was on these gardens that Leighton Stewart built the Yanjing University, and Henry K. Murphy of Yale was the designer of that university, and we've seen a few of those buildings. And today, Peking University has been moved there since 1950, when Mao brought all the national universities out to this beautiful district to the northwest of Beijing. So thank you very much for those. I've been teaching at Peking University in the philosophy department. I'm told I was the first foreigner to do it. My Chinese tell me I was the first, my Chinese colleagues tell me I was the first foreigner. And they invited me because apparently my Chinese was good enough to get through. A Confucian scholar by the name of Zhu Bo-kun, whom I met in Singapore in 1988, asked me to come up for my sabbatical year, and so I did. And I expected to stay a semester, and it's 16 years later. I've had a wonderful time. It's been an unexpected joy. I can't imagine anything harder and more fun to do at the same time. And I invite you all to consider going. There's a call and a need, and I'm grateful for the chance to share with you now some of what I've learned there. My first section begins now, and I think we'll be, yes, now you can see Henry K. Murphy of Yale's design. This is a Chinese design with Western architectural interiors. Thanks, and I think we can probably turn it off for a moment. I think I'll just leave it there for a bit. First section now, God. How does one begin to teach religious studies in communist China? In the fall of 1988, there were scarcely any books in the humanities available to Chinese students, let alone books in Chinese in religious studies. I think there were 2 books, and they were written from a Marxist perspective, which defined religion as belief in spirits and something to be left behind. I had been invited to give lectures in the academic study of religion, yet within 1 week of my arrival, I found out that they weren't just interested in the academic study of religion, they wanted to know about religion personally as well. These were dark, dreary Maoist days in China. There were guarded conversations in hallways and banquets, and people took me aside and would say, you know, we haven't forgotten about what you call religion, and we'd like to know more about it. Would you like to come give a lecture at our academy? Do you have some books you could give me? Could you teach our students? I was surprised. It seemed they were all searching for a deeper meaning in life, and at the same time, I didn't want to offend. These were still mightily Maoist days. One stood in lines for hours. For example, I waited 2 hours to make a single phone call to my husband, while somebody in the phone booth next to me listened very carefully to everything I had to say. And then we were made known that the walls were listening, the tables where we ate were listening, our classrooms were listening. Where do you begin in Maoist China to talk about religion? These were people who had, in many ways, since the beginning of Marxist China, been told that any kind of transcendental thinking was a thing of the past. All folk customs, all Confucian moral cultivation, all Buddhist meditation, all Taoist longevity practices, all were a thing of the past. Where do you begin? I began by praying every single day. In the Propedia of the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1974, Harvard comparative historian of religion and my most beloved of teachers, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, opens with the line, "There is more in human life than meets the eye." With this opening, I began and I still begin. And I talk about more as transcendence, the ultimate, the limitless, which are terms they recognize. And I tell them that transcendence is not just out there, a Western metaphor, it's also in here, in the human heart. That they understand. And I came up with a definition of religion that works for them, and they're very keen on it. It goes like this. The manner in which we discern more in human life than meets the eye is intimately related to the manner in which we discern who we are as human beings, which in turn is related to the manner in which we discern ourselves engaging or participating in more, so that we become more of the best we can humanly be. This leaves open what more is, and it makes it easy for them. For Chinese students, this working cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary definition is markedly different from their reduced sense of religion as mere belief in spirits. Belief in spirits has been suspect for 3,000 years. Kongzi, whom you know as Confucius, has always said, heaven begot the moral capacity within me, but put spirits at a distance. Marx deemed belief in spirits the opiate of the people. Western Enlightenment philosophers, in whom most Chinese today have placed their hope, also replaced belief in spirits with belief in reason. Intellectuals today, receiving influences from Confucianism, Marxism, and Western Enlightenment, are not likely to consider belief in spirits anything to which they should give serious attention. But with this different definition of religion, I'm able to open things up, and the students are keen and interested. I also, because I work in Chinese, I borrow Chinese terms, and I think you've all gotten this term list which I've handed out. And if you look out down on the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a term there called zong and zongjiao. And these are the terms that are translate our Western word religion into Chinese. Zong refers to ancestral group. Jiao refers to instruction in the sense of a superior instructs and an inferior is to emulate what the superior instructs. If you combine these two characters, zong and jiao, you come up with an idea of ways of living of the ancestors that have been handed down from generation to generation, which we are to emulate now. Early on, whatever was conceived as more in human life in China was spirit-like. But then Kongzi thought of more as the way of heaven. Recently, communists have thought of more as the communist utopia at the end of dialectical development. Whatever the discernment, zongjiao or religion, is the instruction by which discernment of more and discernment of humanity in relationship to more are transmitted from generation to generation. Now, zongjiao have never been in isolation from each other. Persons from one ancestral tradition and persons from other ancestral traditions have been interacting from the beginning of time. One could say that the global era began with humanity. In the infinite ways by which traditions of ancestral teachings have been changed through their encounter with others, there has been a pattern of reform. And Chinese scholars, and particularly He Guanghu, have noted three characteristics of this moral reform. First, teachings of one group are offered to another. Second, there is an emphasis on individual responsibility. And third, there is a placement of interest on this world such that how we live now ultimately matters. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, Buddhism, these are several examples of this kind of reform movement. And we are learning, and this is important, we are learning that these reform movements are best understood not as displacing ancestral teachings, but as transforming them. The worldwide diversity of Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Confucianism gives witness to this fact. We can add to this picture another complexity, and that is another kind of reform that came with the Western Enlightenment period. This is the reform of rationalism, which tried to give rational order to all received knowledge. This movement, too, has gone out from the West and gone throughout the globe. And again, we are learning that this rational reform movement does not displace ancestral teachings or their moral reforms, but transforms them. Transforms them in a way that they better understand themselves, they better understand others, and they interconnect in deeper, more profound ways. It is, in fact, this reforming movement and the rational movement over the last 300 years that have generated religious studies today. My Chinese colleagues and students are entranced with this new understanding of religion. They tell me it inspires them, it helps them to resolve irresolvable conflicts. No longer is religion merely belief in spirits. No longer is religion separate from science. No longer is religion some kind of flat object of which there is some kind of plurality, like bumper cars in a bumper rink, smashing into each other, hoping to be the winner. Rather, zongjiao is the inherited tradition of culture through which human engagement with more in life than meets the eye is deepened and broadened. any zongjiao is capable of moral reform, rational reform, and reform from other received traditions. In so doing, zongjiao continues as the vital way any group has of being the best we can humanly be. Chinese people and Chinese leaders are very interested in religious reform and what it can do for Chinese society. In addition, Chinese scholars find in Western religious studies critical methods for deepening their own cultural critique and reform. Reform in the Chinese tradition is not new. The tradition we know in the West as Confucianism is actually a reform tradition in itself. The name in Chinese is Ru, and you're going to hear me say Ru a lot, okay? So if you all want to just say Ru, Ru, that's Confucianism. And Ru means soft, and Confucianism began as a softy movement. Back in 1000 BCE, when the Zhou dynasty was beginning, this was martial arts times. People ruled by the power of the sword. So the rule came along, and they lived in a state called Lu. And here the alliteration, the rule in the state of Lu with their shu, their books, shu. Okay, the rule in Lu with their shu. Okay, and in any case, these were the softies. They said, you can't rule on a horseback. You've got to rule by culture. You've got to rule by study, learning the way of the ancient sage kings. This is the rule softy movement. And Confucius was a softy. He wasn't a martial arts guy, okay? So the point is that this is a reform already, this Confucian movement, even though now in the 20th century it was said to be a reactionary, conservative way of living. In those days, this was innovative, to keep the kingdom by studying and not by killing each other. All right, we're going to move now to the rule reform movement, Confucianism. On October 8th in 2004, I was invited to the 2,555th birthday of Confucius. And I think we're ready for that now, yeah. And if you could just skip through and find our dear friend Kongzi, that'll be great. There he is. See how soft he is? Look at those robes. A real softy. Okay. Now, this conference was very significant. Jiang Zemin had attended 5 years ago, and this year we had the chairman of the Communist Political Consultative Committee with us, Jia Qingling. And there's a beautiful picture which you can all see after if you like. It's a huge thing. It took 10 minutes digital. But I was very moved by the updatedness of this conference. We were wined and dined in 5-star quality. When I went 15 years ago, there was barely a table and a chair to sit on. So things have changed. And there's a lot of promoting of Confucianism in China right now, especially post 9/11. I was landing in Beijing the minute 9/11 happened. In fact, we landed so fast, I was still sitting in the head, as it were, when we landed. And it was a very tumultuous time. But the way the Chinese handled 9/11 after that, and the way they've brought Confucianism out since then as a way of responding to the West's response is important. So I want to read now some of the main ideas of the plenary session of these big leaders who came out to say it's time to bring Confucianism back. Jia Qingling, the chairman of the Political Consultative Committee, spoke first and said, Kongzi, I'm going to say Kongzi instead of Confucius. Kongzi was a great educator, and the Ru school constitutes the basis of Chinese classical culture. Now hear this. He urged that if we're going to have an advanced socialist spiritual culture, we're going to have to make full use of Ru classical culture to help the world, to help China, and to help the world understand China. Mr. Tong Yu, chairman of the International Confucius Association, emphasized Ru thought belongs to the entire human race. It cultivates harmony and peace. Violence can't solve terrorism, but maybe Ru moral cultivation can. Okay? The elder statesman Run Jiyu emphasized that Ru is a national religion, including China and Taiwan. And by pooling all of China's efforts, China can do some really big things now. But to achieve these things, interestingly, we have to absorb some new things from some other traditions. Interesting. Du Weiming of Harvard said Ru instruction is better than Buddhist, Christian, and other teachings for telling us how to be a good human being. Ru instruction encourages awareness of plurality, without which Chinese culture would not have survived for 5,000 years. Think of Tibet. Because each human being is spiritually valuable, Ru instruction is that you should, if you desire to stand, help your brother or sister to stand. For this reason, Ru instruction, Du Weiming says, will be the global language of the future. And then finally, Tang Yijie, my good friend from Peking University, the eminent philosopher who is now about 70, emphasized that Kong's teachings that have spread throughout Japan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Singapore, Korea, Ru instruction is about love. Extend the love of your family to others and extend love from humanity to nature. You cannot govern the world by hegemony, but you can with Ru harmony. Now, obviously, running through all of this is a very anti-Western theme. Western culture, in Ru eyes, is militant, domineering, destructive, treats human beings like mere tools, uses weapons as instruments of greed, lacks mutual respect for others, and seeks not harmony, but the dominance of the strong over the weak. By contrast, and this will sound familiar, by contrast, this Kongzi birthday party group recommended Ru instruction as a better way, a gentler way, they say, a way that will never claim hegemony, a way that has a mission for global peace, a gentle, harmonious, peaceful way. What is this way? 35 years ago, when I began my studies in Ru culture with David Nivison at Stanford, now you can see some nice images of Ru harmony, and we have one more, harmony and peace, one more after this, I think. Here you are, sitting in the gardens, strumming away, and he has put down his books for a moment. Everything is in its proper place, harmony and peace, and in a moment, benevolence. When I began my studies at Stanford University 35 years ago, my teacher, David Nivison, focused us all on the concept of de. Now, you'll see in your handout, they're alphabetical along the left-hand side, and you'll find de there. And I'm going to be working with Chinese characters because they speak better, even in English, as it were, than any English translation. The ancient Chinese notion of de works in this way. It's a power that can accrue through beneficial acts shown to others. Now, those who receive a beneficial act will immediately respond with a sense of, I owe this person something back. And so, de, in the one sense, is benevolence to another, but it also encourages a response of benevolence back to you. This whole theme runs through the whole of Chinese civilization, and we'll be getting at that from various levels in a moment. On the one hand, de is that by which one is generous, and on the other hand, de is that by which which is enhanced by acts of generosity. So you have de to begin with, and you act generously. But when you do, your de is cultivated, and you can act even more generously the second time around. Now, strictly speaking, De is power which is endowed by heaven, or heaven's order. And you've all heard the word Tao, right? You have it on your sheet there. Anciently and today, heaven's order is discerned as a grand web of relationships, all modeled on the parent-child relationship that lacks parity. That is to say, in all relationships, there is an elder who has position, power, and responsibility to provide food, clothing, shelter, and education for the younger, and a younger who receives the elder's provision and gives thanks through loyalty, obedience, and material gifts of gratitude back to the elder. There are no equals in relationships. Even among friends, one is always older. And I always marvel at this when Chinese students go to the movies and they're all in the same class. Somebody always is in position to buy the tickets. And someone always is in position to take people out to dinner. And those wonderful movies, you've all seen them with bowing and so on. Imagine 100 people. The Chinese have a keen sense of who has to sit where. There's no universal chairness. There's a chair for each particular person. And that chair is different from everybody else's chair. And you've got to find out which chair you sit in. Now, for over 1,000 years, Chinese have been aware and tried to cultivate this De, but sadly, the benevolence I can do, I do not. What is the problem? Is the problem a lack of focused reflection? Is the lack of focused reflection a lack of will? Is the lack of will due to something lacking in human nature? And if there is nothing lacking in human nature, is the lack of will due to something in my psychophysical stuff called qi? Is there something wrong with my qi? And it can't be that my qi is all wrong, but maybe it's my passions, which are associated with the qi, that's wrong. And so in all of these ways, Confucians over 2,500 years have tried to sort out, why is it that the benevolence I can do, I do not? Now, the one solution, whether or not you locate the problem in the will or the human nature or the qi or the passions, the solution in every case is study the way of the ancient sage kings and emulate them. Now, there's a wonderful story about how the Zhou dynasty militarily threw out the Shang dynasty when the Shang kings had become corrupt, didn't take care of the widows and children, took the people out of their labors in the fields to fight unjust wars and so on. So the Zhou, who had brought harmony to the kingdom, threw out the Shang with military means and said heaven did it. And as a result, they were convinced that heaven had given them the mandate to rule, and said, now we are the kings of De, and now we are the ones that will rule the kingdom. Now, shortly after the Shang were thrown out, the Zhou kings had to quell a rebellion of the Shang. And at this point, a very famous character by the name of Duke of Zhou comes on the scene. And the Duke of Zhou is regent to the young King Cheng. He's 8 years old, the king. And the Duke of Zhou is like his senior advisor. And the Duke of Zhou gives so much instruction to this young king that people are beginning to wonder, does the Duke want to throw out the king and become king himself? And I want you to listen to the Duke of Zhou's response, because it's quite famous and it tells you a lot about the Ru tradition. The Duke of Zhou responds by saying, now it rests with me, the little child Tan. I am as if floating on a great stream. I shall, and together with you, cross it. Do not request me to retire. Without encouragement, I shall not succeed. If men who are old and of illustrious De do not condescend to help, to us of the Zhou no singing bird will be heard, much less shall we succeed. The mandate we have received, limitless is its beauty, great are its difficulties. You should brightly exert yourself to be a helpmate to the king and to the utmost carry out this great mandate. And he finishes by saying, I exert myself for heaven and the people. This story of the Duke of Zhou is one that Kongzi, Confucius, loved. And the story of the Duke of Zhou and the throwing out of the Shang is handed down in bits and pieces and comes to us today as the 5 Confucian classics. Kongzi received all this, all that I've told you to this point, none of it Confucius made up, although his name, Confucius now, is given to this whole tradition. Confucius walks on the scene in 500 BC. All of this is in place already, and he adds 3 small emphases. He says, I transmit, but I do not create. He says, here are my 3 emphases. Cultivate the way of the ancient sage kings, but as you do that, cultivate the inner heart of benevolence. And the second part is cultivation of the heart of benevolence takes a lifetime. And you should extend benevolence from your family out into the world. And the third point is a person of benevolence is a truly noble person. You'll see it on your list, a junzi. But the point of a junzi is he or she studies in order to serve the people. In other words, as I say to all my students in the States or in China, your studies are not for an income. Your studies are to serve the people. The master said, failure to cultivate de, failure to explore what I have learned, incapacity to do what I know is right, incapacity to reform what I know is, to reform what is not good, these are the things that worry me. Now, Confucius was not a law person. There's a good Confucian sage. Confucius was not a law person. He did not recommend rule of law in the sense of law stipulating what each must do. Instead, he advocated this moral cultivation with the feeling that if you cultivated with de, you would be like the pole star. It remains in place and everyone comes and gathers around you. And believe me, that's what China is anticipating to be. The country of moral force around which the world will do homage, the great central kingdom. The master said, lead the people with government regulations. Keep them orderly with penal law, and sure enough, they will avoid punishment but will have no sense of shame. But lead them with de, order them with ritual, and they will develop a sense of shame. And more than that, they will order themselves. Chinese today, if you talk to taxi drivers, if you talk to intellectuals, they want rule of law. But the real difficulty is, I'm not sure they completely understand what kind of rule of law they want. And when they hear about rule of law in the West, they don't understand the covenant tradition that's underneath it. And that we're going to turn to that in the last section, but it's a real difficulty right now in this whole area of rule of law. So I want to stress that as I move on to what one other area that is interesting to Chinese intellectuals today, and that is what Christian faith brings to Confucianism. Now, I would suggest there are 2 things that Christian faith brings to Confucianism, and I'm going to list these quickly because I want to get onto human rights. But the first is that I want to take that metaphor of the treasure in the clay jar. I think that Christ is the jewel in the clay jar. He is the living water, the light, the mustard seed, the pearl, which is we can offer as Christians to Chinese people, but without displacing their zong, their tradition. That treasure goes over into the Chinese context and works miracles. I see it on Christian faces in China that would surprise you. That's the first way we have of offering Christ. The second way we have of offering Christ is what we have here, our clay jar. As Christians, we are witness to this treasure which has transformed our own heritages, our own ancestral heritages, and gives witness in how we live to who Christ is. We offer that witness as a clay jar, which is imperfect. The treasure in the jar is perfect. That treasure is offered by God. But the clay jar that we offered is a humble clay jar witness. Here's several images of clay jars. Is a clay jar witness of what we've done with that treasure in the best way that we possibly can. It's important how we offer our clay jar image of Christ, because if we offer it arrogantly, it will put off the receiving of the treasure in the clay jar. Christ, after all, does not impose. If I'm correct in suggesting that there are two ways we offer Christ, I would like to look into how a Chinese person would receive Christ. And here we need to attend to Chinese metaphysics and not impose our own. Let's go back to the notion of De. Transcendence, or De, is in the human being. It's not out there, it's interior to the human mind-heart. The heart-mind is the affective, cognitive, volitional control center, by whose initiative what is invisible inwardly becomes manifest outwardly in emotion, thought, and deed, word and deed. So again, De is transcendent, it's perfect, it's inside, it's invisible, but the heart-mind is the mechanism that moves what is interior out into the world, into expression. So, if there's any fall in this context, it's the fall of the heart-mind. The heart-mind is not functioning properly. To use other words, if there is a moral gap, to use John Hare's words, it is in the area of the heart-mind. And may I say, and I've wanted to say this for a long time, if there is one book that should be translated immediately into Chinese, it is John Hare's Moral Gap. It is so desperately needed and fits perfectly with Chinese interest in Kant. The gap between heaven's endowment for benevolence, De, and what a person does in the world is the province of the heart-mind. Traditionally, the heart-mind is that area of human life considered solely under human control. No divine assistance here. But what if there were? What if Christ takes the lack of focused reflection? What if Christ takes the lack of will, the lack of cultivation, the burden of choices one never wanted to make, the overwhelming grief of what has been lost? What if Christ takes the agony beyond words that one did not do better, although heaven knows one tried? What if Christ takes that all into death upon the cross, remembered no more? And what if Christ's Spirit is added to the heart-mind so that it now moves through the way of heaven? Now the heart-mind would function properly. It would have a vitality much like Mengzi's Haoran Zhiqi, a special energy. Repaired, the heart would do what it's supposed to do. And the De would find manifestation in the world. With cultivation, then, the benevolence one can do in Christ is done. Healed, there is a sense of the human heart-mind in intimate association with heaven. Christians tell me they co-partner with God, like ancient sages co-partnered with heaven. What do co-partners with God do in China? They smile. Chinese haven't smiled for very long. Their road has been long and it has been tough. Chinese Christians smile. And then they tell you they're going to start old folks' homes. They tell you they're going to open schools for children. They tell you that they're going to bring water into a village. They're going to open a school for the deaf. They're going to teach the child next door to read. They're going to stop quarreling in their families. Villagers are going to get over 6th century-old fights. In other words, the heart-mind healed in Christ, it does not abandon the Chinese zong or zongjiao, but reforms it, gives it new life. And because of that, The Chinese government is coming behind Christian churches and Christian seminaries and providing money to build. But notice that what has happened here is a change of heart-mind, not a change of ancestral tradition. Whenever I'm moving now on to human rights, because I want to look at what this new heart in Christ in the Confucian tradition can tell us about human rights. Whenever I meet a group of Chinese leaders or intellectuals in the Washington, D.C. area, I immediately take them to the Thomas Jefferson Memorial. And I say, read those 4 panels. And they read. And they say, oh, I didn't know religion had so much to do with it. I didn't know that there was a theology of the Republic. Now, we may disagree about what that theology of the Republic is, but I work with those like Max Stackhouse and John Witta and Daniel Eleazar and David Novak, who find the canon within the canon to be covenant theology. But suffice it to say that underneath our Constitution and our laws is a theology which focuses on humanity made in the image of God. And it also is foundationally focused on the commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, which has been translated into a form of government, checks and balances government, to the effect that no one group can shout down any other group. Now, out of all this, we get human rights law, that no one person or group can take from another person or group. They're being made in the image of God. Nor can we take his or her freedom or a group's freedom to become all that we can humanly be in the image of God. Now, we take all of this for granted, but for Chinese who want rule of law, they know nothing about it. They know nothing of the covenant theology under our rule of law, and they're confused. Now, traditionally, anyone can be a sage in China in the Wu teaching. The difficulty is that today, this has not yet been fully translated into education and civil society. Whether during the days of the Empire or Mao or the Cultural Revolution, the Wu, the greatly cultivated intellectual ones, have had a rather restricted role as they advise those at the center. China has never been a Confucian country any more than the West has been entirely Christian. But those advising those at the center have had a very important role in encouraging rule that was morally based on moral cultivation. Now, efforts still need to be made to make sure that every individual in China knows that he or she is a person of De and can cultivate that De to become a co-partner with heaven. The Wu intellectuals have not yet taken this step. But were they to do so, and I think they could do so in Christ, it would work a revolution. It would go back to the 3,000-year-old beginning of the Zhou dynasty, when their teaching was that heaven is on the side of the people, and that heaven hears as the people hear. Were all of this to happen, were the De discerned in each person and educational resources brought to each Chinese person, it would work and it would bring a total revolution in understanding of government, because government could then come up through the people, through the intellectual advisors, to the center. Now, some say at Kong's 2,555th birthday party that recognizing each person as one of De will take assistance from other teachings. I agree. Quietly, these days, some discern Christ already at work in the process. Were this to develop, it would advance and influence China's experiment in democracy. I would like to suggest that it would bring out an alternative view of human rights already present in human instruction, a view that resonates with Jewish covenant theology. Now, we know that the 5 normative relations in feudal times in China, you've all heard them, the leader and minister, the father, the son, the husband, the wife, the elder brother, the younger brother, and friend to friend. No parity in any of these relations. The older one takes care of the younger one, and the younger one gives thanks back to the older one. David Novak, in his new book, Covenantal Rights, A Study in Jewish Political Theory, has brought out another way of understanding rights, which I think aligns nicely with Confucian thought. Novak points out that the person in higher position is in a position of responsible providing, and the person in lesser position is in the position of grateful receiving. So you have duty, responsible duty in the superior position, and you have claim or right on the part of the person in lesser position to what the senior can provide. Claim or right here on the part of the person in lesser position does not have to do with the power one has oneself, but rather with the power that another has, which the other has responsibility to cultivate to maturity in order to respond to the rightful claim another is making upon that power. Interesting, sinner-error in this relationship is one of two kinds. One is to have a power and not cultivate it to the point of being able to provide. That's one area of sin. And the other area of sin, which I think is very intuitive, is making a claim on another for a power the other person doesn't have to provide. In other words, heaven has ordered those with power to provide and ordered those to make claims or have right to those powers. That's heaven's order, and we aren't to question it. We are to work within it and cultivate the best we can of our moral character within it. Now, what's nice about this approach is that it focuses on the gracious side of giving and the humble side of receiving, which is different from natural law, human rights theory, which seems to operate sort of naturally without any thanks or graciousness on either side. The Ru approach to rights, with affinities with the Jewish covenant tradition as David Novak has developed it, is very attractive to Chinese scholars. For this approach to rights, which encourages cultivation of moral benevolence of character, offers needed critique of the view held by modern Chinese and Westerners alike that civil society functions solely upon a foundation of secular law. Senior officials at Kongzi's birthday party suggest that human rights involve a primary role of building up the moral character of a people, and that this is primary to any democratic order. Constitutional rule of law, specifically human rights law, is necessary, but moral cultivation of benevolence of character is also necessary and more primary to creating and sustaining a democracy. For exercise of rule of law, whether constitutional or penal law, depends on the character of those adjudicating the law. And rule of law that is only secular and most often ends up being exercised largely out of concern, largely by those with power and not with much concern for the powerless. So it would seem that some kind of understanding of responsibility, covenantal responsibility, and some kind of cultivation of the moral heart is necessary for sustaining a democracy and for the proper exercise of rule of law. Some have argued this case from the side of Greek virtue ethics. I'm arguing it from the side of Judeo-Christian ethics and its confluence with Ru ethics. In addition, as a follower of Calvin, I am hoping for the special grace of Christ to be added to the Ru tradition. I want to conclude now. In recent years, the world, through representatives of the United Nations, has conceived of human rights in three covenants. The first is the civil and political human rights covenant. The second is the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant. And the third is the Solidarity Rights Covenant. The Chinese, with their preference for human rights in the sense of responsibility for and claims to provision of food, clothing, shelter, and education, and networks of family-style relationships, have ratified the Second Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. They did so in 2001. In 1992, the United States ratified the First Covenant, but not the Second. It is my view, and that of others, that were the United States to ratify in signature and practice the Second Covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, this would lead the Chinese to ratify the First Covenant on civil and political rights. They would ratify it not only in signature but in practice. I would suggest that if we are benevolent and generous enough to support their covenant on human rights, they will be generous and benevolent in supporting our covenant on human rights. We have to make the first move. And then finally, recalling the metaphor of the treasure in a clay jar, each of our heritages bears a gift, a treasure to the other. Healed, the new heart in Christ gathers all cultural gifts into the body of Christ, coming to shape in the global era. I like to think of this as Epiphany. God's self-sacrificing, providing love coming to us, receives, gathers in, and gathers new life, gives new life to the gifts he's already endowed in his creation. Whether or not you agree with me in this view, I would suggest that human rights understood on the one hand as responsibility to provide benevolently for others, and on the other hand as right to lay claim to this provision humbly and generously in turn, are both necessary to the clay jar of global civilization taking place. Both are normative to loving others as God has loved us, even to great personal sacrifice. And the Chinese know sacrifice just as we have. Thomas Jefferson said these words, "I have sworn on the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Here again the words of the Duke of Zhou, who Confucius cherished deeply. "Now it rests with me, the little child Tan. Do not request me to retire. Without encouragement, I shall not succeed. If men of old and illustrious do not condescend to help, how shall we be able to succeed? The mandate which we have received, limitless is its beauty, but great are its difficulties. You should exert yourself to be a helpmate to the leader, and to the utmost carry out this grand mandate. I thereby exert myself for heaven and the people." Those working in China today, like myself, are joyously uplifted by Confucian Christians coming towards us. Have you ever met a Confucian sage? And a sage is one, we just saw a few pictures. If you have met a Confucian sage, you'll know him by his deference, you'll know him by his humility, and you'll know him by his grace. There are several Confucian sages present here in this room this evening. Get to know them. God is at work in China in rich and surprising ways, and there is much yet to be done. Will you join us? And I thank you for coming. And there you go. Oh, let's hold on to that last one. There they are, new Christians just baptized on the stage in the church in Hangzhou, where I worship every Sunday. And thank you so very much for your interest in China.